Japanese, beginning on November 2nd, spent a week running destroyer and cruiser deckloads of soldiers down the slot, 65 destroyer deckloads, and 2 cruiser loads in all. On November 8th, PTs hit the destroyer Mochizuki but did not sink it. This kind of reinforcement was not fast enough to satisfy the Japanese brass, so they planned to stop sending a boy to do a man's job. At Truk, they organized a mighty task force of 2 light carriers, 4 battleships, 11 cruisers, and 36 destroyers to escort 11 fast transports to Guadalcanal on November 14th. Before risking the transports, jammed with soldiers, to be landed at Tassafaronga, the Japanese planned to bombard Henderson Field for 2 straight nights to eliminate once and for all the dangerous marine airplanes based there. The climactic sea struggle for Guadalcanal began on the night of November 12, 1942. American scouting planes and Allied coast watchers sent word that a frighteningly powerful bombardment force was on its way down the slot, and the most optimistic defenders of Guadalcanal wondered if this was going to be the end. 2 Japanese battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima, a cruiser, and 14 destroyers were in the Japanese fleet. The Japanese had learned to fear the PT boats of Tulagi. The fleet commander had posted 2 destroyers on one advanced flank and 3 destroyers on the other as a torpedo boat screen. In addition, he had assigned 3 other destroyers, not counted among the 14 under his direct command, to rove ahead on an anti-PT patrol. In a swirling, half-hour action on Friday, November 13th, the opening of the 3-day naval battle of Guadalcanal, the United States Navy lost the cruiser Atlanta, the destroyers Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Monson, and suffered severe damage to the cruisers Portland, San Francisco, Helena, Juneau, and to 3 destroyers. Admiral Daniel J. Callahan was killed. Limping home after the battle, the cruiser Juneau was torpedoed by the submarine I-26, whose skipper admits that he was aiming at another ship entirely. The Juneau disappeared in a blast of smoke and flame. In one of the most tragic and inexplicable misadventures of the war, the survivors of the Juneau, floating within easy reach of the PTs at Tulagi, were abandoned, and no attempt was made to rescue them until all but a handful had died of exposure. It is possible that the PT's excellent rescue craft, manned by sailors eager to help stricken shipmates, were so new to the theater that the top brass didn't even know of their presence, or at least weren't in the habit of thinking about them. At any rate, the PTs were tied up at Tulagi while American sailors drowned almost within sight of the harbor. On the night between November 13th and 14th, 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, screened by a light cruiser and 4 destroyers, steamed toward Guadalcanal with another load of bombardment shells. The situation on Guadalcanal was grave. The base was crammed with the sick and weary survivors of the naval battle. The veteran defenders knew another punishing flotilla was on its way with possibly the final, fatal, load of fragmentation shells aboard, and there were no big American ships near enough to them to say nay. The United States Navy had almost shot its bolt, at least temporarily. Almost, but not quite. 2 PTs were still in the fight. One, commanded by Stilly Taylor, and another, commanded by John Searles, had been screening the heavy cruiser Portland, which had been badly damaged in the previous night's battle, and was being towed to Tulagi. Stilly Taylor tells what happened in one of the most momentously important torpedo boat adventures of the Pacific War. The Japs began to shell Henderson Field, first putting a very bright flare in the vicinity of the field, and, so naturally both of us, the 2 PTs, started in on them independently. As soon as the Japs opened fire, it was obvious to us that there was at least one fairly heavy ship. We thought it was probably a battleship. We could tell it was definitely a heavy ship because of the long orange flash from its gunfire, rather than the short white flash, which we knew from experience was the smaller fire of the destroyers. Due to the light put up by the nip flares, I was able to use my director for the first time. I set the target's speed at about 20 knots, and I think he was doing slightly more than this. I kept him in the director for approximately 7 of his salvos, and really had a beautiful line on him. PT boats usually were forced, by bad visibility at night, and in bad weather, to shoot from the hip. A chance to use a director, for visually aimed fire, was an unaccustomed luxury, well worth gloating over in an action report. After closing to about 1,000 yards, I decided that if we went in any farther, we would get tangled up in the destroyer screen, which I knew would be surrounding him at about 500 to 700 yards. I therefore fired 3 fish. The 4th misfired and never left the tube. The 3 fish landed beautifully and made no flash as we fired them. We immediately turned around and started back for the base, but we had the torpedoes running hot and straight toward the target. I am positive that at least one of them found its mark. Certainly, the nips ceased fire immediately and apparently turned right around and limped home. Nobody knows what damage these 2 PTs did that night. Planes the next day found a badly damaged cruiser leaving the scene, and that could well have been Taylor's victim. At any rate, the material damage inflicted by these 2 brave seamen and their crews is comparatively unimportant. What is important is the almost incredible, but quite possible fact, that the 2 cockle shells ran off a horribly dangerous Japanese surface fleet, prepared to give Henderson Field what might well have been its death blow. As soon as the torpedo boats attacked, the Japanese stopped shooting and ran. It is not hard to understand why. The American fleet had been badly battered during the previous night's battle, but so had the Japanese fleet, and Japanese nerves were probably raw and jumpy. The 2 PTs achieved complete surprise, and a surprise attack in restricted waters is always unsettling to naval officers, even the most cocksure and well-rested. The Japanese could not be sure exactly who was attacking, and in what force. They could have had only a dim idea of what damage they had done to the American Navy the night before, and for all they knew, the torpedo tracks they saw came from a dangerous destroyer flotilla, backed up by who knows how many mighty ships of the line. With their nerves shaken by the suddenness of the torpedo attack, and with no knowledge of what was prowling around out there in the dark, it apparently seemed best to the Japanese commanders to abandon the bombardment quickly and save their ships for another day. The 2 glorified cabin cruisers had driven off the Japanese task force. Only 3 planes had been destroyed and 17 damaged. All the damaged planes were in the air before the end of the next day, and Henderson Field was still in action. The next day, November the 14th, a smoothly functioning Henderson Field was host not only to the Marine planes permanently based there, but also to Navy planes from the carrier Enterprise, which landed at Henderson for refueling during shuttle trips to attack 11 fast Japanese transports coming down the slot. All-day attacks on November the 14th by the Marine, Navy, and Army planes, saved from destruction by the 2 PT boats, sank 7 of the transports, and worked a hideous massacre among the Japanese soldiers on their decks and in their holds. 4 of the transports and 11 destroyers survived, and at sunset were sailing for the Japanese beach head of Tassafaronga Point. The destroyers carried deckloads of survivors from the sunken transports. The destroyer commander was Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, perhaps the most brilliant combat officer of the Japanese Navy. He repeatedly showed a fantastic devotion to duty that enabled him to carry out his missions in spite of seemingly impossible difficulties. Tanaka was the Tokyo Express. To give Tanaka little help with the disembarkation of the troops at Guadalcanal, the Japanese planned to bombard Henderson during the landings as a diversion, and just possibly as a coup de grace to further American air resistance. They sent a battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers to do the job. This time the light cruisers and destroyers were deployed in a formidable anti-torpedo boat screen to prevent a recurrence of the previous night's spooking from a measly 2-boat PT raid. The Japanese had lost their chance, however, for much more American naval power than a brace of torpedo boats stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field. Admiral W.A. Lee, on the battleship Washington, had arrived from the south, accompanied by the battleship South Dakota and 4 destroyers. He sailed north to meet the Japanese across Iron Bottom Bay, so called because the bottom was littered with the hulks of Japanese and American ships sunk in earlier battles. There were so many holes on the ocean's floor that quartermasters reported to their skippers that magnetic compasses were deflected by the scrap iron. The American admiral, known to his intimates as Ching-Li, had a bad moment when he overheard two PTs gossiping about his battleships over the voice radio. "There go two big ones, but I don't know whose they are," said one PT skipper. Admiral Lee grabbed the microphone and quickly identified himself to shore headquarters before the PTs could get off a nervous shot. "Refer your big boss about Ching-Li. Chinese, catchy. Call off your boys." The PT skippers answered with good humor that they were well acquainted with old Ching, and promised not to go after him. The PT crews watched Admiral Lee sail into the decisive last action of the three-day Battle of Guadalcanal. That night, his ships sank the Japanese battleship and routed the Japanese bombardment fleet. But the mixed transport and destroyer reinforcement flotilla was taken, nevertheless, by the stubborn and wily Admiral Tanaka around the action and to the beach at Tassafaronga, where he carried out his reinforcement mission, almost literally, come hell or high water. The Japanese had made a mighty effort, but American flyers, sailors, and PT boatmen had spoiled the assault. The only profit to the Japanese from the bloody 3 days was the landing of 2,000 badly shaken soldiers, 260 cases of ammunition, and 1,500 bags of rice. But the Japanese were not totally discouraged. They had the redoubtable Tanaka on their side, and so they went back to supply by the Tokyo Express. The idea was for Tanaka's fast destroyers to run down the slot by night to Tassafaronga Point, where sailors would push overboard drums of supplies. Troops ashore would then round up the floating drums in small boats. In that way, Tanaka's fast destroyers would not have to stop moving, and would make a less tempting target for the Tulagi PTs than a transport at anchor. On November 30, 1942, Admiral Tanaka shoved off from Bougainville Island with 8 destroyers loaded with 1,100 drums of supplies. At the same moment, an American task force of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers, a most formidable task force indeed, especially for a night action, left the American base at Espiritu Santo to break up just the kind of supply run Tanaka was undertaking. The two forces converged on Tassafaronga Point from opposite directions. The American force enormously outgunned Tanaka's destroyers, and also had the tremendous advantage of being, to some extent, equipped with radar, then a brand new and little understood gadget. Thus the American force could expect to enjoy an additional superiority of surprise. And that is just the way it worked out. At 11:06 p.m., American radar picked up Tanaka's ships. Admiral Tanaka's comparatively feeble flotilla was blindly sailing into a trap. American destroyers fired 20 torpedoes at the still unsuspecting Japanese, who did not wake up to their danger, until the cruisers opened fire with main battery guns at 5-mile range. The Japanese lashed back with a reflex almost as automatic for Tanaka's well-drilled destroyer sailors as jerking a finger back from a red-hot stove. They instantly filled the water with torpedoes. No American torpedoes scored. 6 Japanese torpedoes hit 4 American cruisers, sinking Northampton and damaging Pensacola, Minneapolis, and New Orleans so seriously that they were unfit for action for almost a year. Cruiser gunfire sank 1 Japanese destroyer, but the rest of Admiral Tanaka's ships, besides giving the vastly superior American force a stunning defeat, even managed to push overboard many of the drums they had been sent down to deliver. Tanaka had once more carried out his mission, and had won a great naval victory, almost as a sideline to the main business. On the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1942, Admiral Tanaka came down again with 11 destroyers. This time, it was not a mighty cruiser-destroyer force waiting for him, but only 8 PTs from Tulagi. They were manned, however, by some of the most aggressive officers and men in the American Navy. The boats were deployed around Cape Esperance and Savo Island, on the approaches to Tassafaronga. 2. Patrolling torpedo boats spotted Tanaka's destroyers and attacked, but one broke down and the other came to his rescue, so no shots were fired. Nevertheless, the admiral was spooked by the abortive attack of two diminutive PTs and retreated. He recovered his courage in a few minutes and tried again. This time 4 PTs jumped him and fired 12 torpedoes. When their tubes were empty, the PTs roared by the destroyers, strafing with their machine guns, and being strafed. Jack Searles, in 59, passed down the Oyashio's side less than 100 yards away, raking the destroyer's superstructure and gun crews with 50 caliber fire. The 59 itself was also riddled, of course, but stayed afloat. Admiral Tanaka, who had run around the blazing duel of battle wagons at the Battle of Guadalcanal to deliver his reinforcements, who had bored through massive day-long air attacks, who had gutted a mighty cruiser force to deliver his cargo to Tassafaronga, turned back before the threat of 4 PTs, abandoned the mission, and fled back to Bougainville. The PT Navy at Tulagi, and the Marines and soldiers on Guadalcanal, had good cause to celebrate a clear-cut victory on this first anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Times were too hard for the PTs to get any rest. Jack Searles patched up his bullet-torn 59, and, with another boat, put out 2 nights later, on December 9th, to machine gun a Japanese landing barge sighted near Cape Esperance. During the barge-PT duel, one of Searles' lookouts spotted a submarine on the surface, oozing along at about 2 knots. Jack whipped off 2 quick shots, and blew a 2,000-ton blockade-running submarine, I-3, into very small pieces. There is no way to deny the submarine to Jack Searles' bag, because a Japanese naval officer, the sole survivor, swam ashore and told the story of the I-3's last moments. On the night of December 11th, Admiral Tanaka began another run of the Tokyo Express with 10 destroyers. Dive bombers attacked during daylight, but made no hits. The job of stopping Tanaka's Tokyo Express was passed to the PTs. They zipped out of the harbor at Tulagi and deployed along the beach between Tassafaronga and Cape Esperance. The night was bright and clear, and shortly after midnight 3 PTs, commanded by Lieutenant Lester H. Gamble, saw the destroyer column and attacked. The other 2 boats were skippered by Stilly Taylor and Lieutenant William E. Kreiner III. The Japanese destroyers turned on their searchlights and let go with main batteries and machine guns, but the 3 torpedo boats got off their torpedoes and popped 2 solid hits into the destroyer Teruzuki. The Japanese ship blazed up, and for the second time Tanaka had had enough of torpedo boats. He went home. The PTs had not yet had enough of Tanaka, however, for Lieutenant Frank Freeland's 44 heard the combat talk of his squadron mates on the voice radio, and came running. He roared past the burning Teruzuki, chasing the retreating destroyers. 2 things were working against him. Lieutenant Freeland did not know it, but one of the destroyers had stayed behind with the Teruzuki, and the flames from the burning ship were lighting the PT boat beautifully for the hidden Japanese gunners. Aboard the 44 was Lieutenant Charles M. Melhern, who reports his version of what happened. We were throwing up quite a wake, and with the burning cargo ship, he probably mistook the burning Teruzuki for a cargo ship, lighting up the whole area. I thought we would soon be easy pickings, and I told the skipper so. Before he could reply, Crow, the quartermaster who was at the wheel, pointed and yelled out, "Destroyer on the starboard bow. There's your target, Captain." Through the glasses, I could make out a destroyer 2 points on our starboard bow, a distance of about 8,000 yards, course south-southwest. We came right and started our run. We had no sooner steadied on our new course than I picked up 2 more destroyers through my glasses. They were in a column 30 degrees on our port bow, target course 270, coming up fast. The skipper and I both saw at once that continuing our present course would pin us against the beach and lay us wide open to broadsides from at least 3 Japanese cans. The skipper shifted targets to the 2 destroyers, still about 4,000 yards off, and we started in again. By this time, we were directly between the blazing ship and the 2 destroyers. As we started the run, I kept looking for the can that had fired. I picked him up behind and to the left of our targets. He was swinging, apparently to form up in a column astern of the other two. The trap was sprung, and as I pointed out this fourth destroyer, the lead ship in the column opened fire. The 44 escaped from the destroyer ambush behind a smoke screen, but once clear, turned about for a second attack. The burning Teruzuki illuminated, the 44, and Teruzuki's guardian destroyer, lurking in the dark, drew a bead on the ambushed PT. We had just come out of our turn when we were fired on. I saw the blast, yelled "That's for us," and jumped down on the port side by the cockpit. We were hit aft in the engine room. I don't remember much. For a few seconds nothing registered at all. I looked back and saw a gaping hole in what was once the engine room canopy. The perimeter of the hole was ringed by little tongues of flame. I looked down into the water and saw we had lost way. Someone on the bow said, "Shall we abandon ship?" Freeland gave the order to go ahead and abandon ship. I stayed at the cockpit. Glancing over where the shell came from, he let go again. I dove deep and was still under when the salvo struck. The concussion jarred me badly, but I kept swimming underwater. There was a tremendous explosion, paralyzing me from the waist down. The water around me went red. The life jacket took control and pulled me to the surface. I came up in a sea of fire, the flaming embers of the boat cascading all about me. I tried to get free of the life jacket, but couldn't. I started swimming feebly. I thought the game was up, but the water which had shot sky high in the explosion rained down and put out the fires around me. I took a few strokes away from the gasoline fire, which was raging about 15 yards behind me, and as I turned back I saw two heads, one still helmeted, between me and the flames. I called to the two men and told them that I expected the Japs to be over in short order to machine gun us, and to get their life jackets ready to slip. I told them to get clear of the reflection of the fire as quickly as possible, and proceeded to do so myself. I struck out for Savo, whose skyline ridge I could see dimly, and gradually made headway toward the shore. Every 2 or 3 minutes I stopped to look back for other survivors or an approaching destroyer, but saw nothing save the boat, which was burning steadily, and beyond it the Teruzuki, which burned and exploded all night long. Sometime shortly before dawn a PT boat cruised up and down off Savo, and passed about 25 yards ahead of me. I was all set to hail him when I looked over my shoulder and saw a Japanese can bearing down on his starboard quarter. I didn't know whether the PT was maneuvering to get a shot at him or not, so I kept my mouth shut. I let him go by, slipped my life jacket, and waited for the fireworks. The Japanese can lay motionless for some minutes, and I finally made it out as nothing more than a destroyer-shaped shadow formed by the fires and smoke. I judged that I finally got ashore on Savo about 0730 or 0800. Lieutenant Stilly Taylor picked me up off the beach about an hour later. Lieutenant Melhern was in the water between 5 and 6 hours. Only one other sailor survived the explosion of the 44's gas tank. 2 officers and 7 enlisted men died. Flames on the Teruzuki, the same flames that lit the way to its fiery death for the 44, finally ate their way into the depth charge magazine, and just before dawn, the Japanese destroyer went up with a jarring crash. More important to the fighters on Guadalcanal than the sinking of the Teruzuki was the astonishing and gratifying fact that Admiral Tanaka, the destroyer Tiger, had been turned back one more time by a handful of wooden cockle shells, without landing his supplies. The big brass of the cruiser fleet, that had been unable to stop Tanaka at the Battle of Tassafaronga, must have been bewildered. After the clash between Tanaka and the torpedo boats on December 11th, no runs of the Tokyo Express were attempted for 3 weeks. The long lull meant dull duty for the PTs, but it was a proof of their effectiveness in derailing the Tokyo Express. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were down to eating roots and leaves, and sometimes even other Japanese, according to persistent reports among the Japanese themselves, before their navy worked up enough nerve to try another run of the Tokyo Express. On January 2nd, 10 destroyers came down the slot. One was damaged by a dive bomber's near miss, and another was detached to escort the cripple, but the other 8 sailed on. That night, 11 PTs attacked Tanaka's destroyers with 18 torpedoes, but had no luck. Tanaka unloaded his drums and was gone before dawn. No matter, as soon as the sun came up, the PTs put it about Iron Bottom Bay, enjoying a bit of target practice on the drums pushed off the destroyer's decks. One way or the other, the torpedo boats of Tulagi snatched food from the mouths of the starving Japanese garrison. A week later, a coast watcher up the line called in word that Tanaka was running 8 destroyers down the slot. Rouse out the PTs again. Just after midnight on January 13th, Lieutenant Rollin Westholme, in PT 112, saw 4 destroyers and called for a coordinated attack with Lieutenant Charles E. Tilden's 43. "Make 'em good," Lieutenant Westholme said. So Lieutenant Tilden took his 43 into 400-yard range before firing 2. Both missed. To add to his disastrous bad luck, the port tube flashed a bright red light, a blazing giveaway of the 43's position. The destroyer hit the 43 with the second salvo, and all hands went over the side, diving deep to escape machine gun strafing. The destroyer passed close enough so that the swimming sailors could hear the Japanese chattering on the deck. Lieutenant Clark W. Faulkner, in 4T, drew a bead on the second destroyer in column and fired 4. His heart was made glad by what he thought was a juicy hit, so he took his empty tubes back home. Lieutenant Westholme, in 112, took on the 3rd destroyer and was equally certain he had put one into his target. But 2 of the destroyers had zeroed in during his approach run, and 2 shells blew his boat open at the waterline. Lieutenant Westholme and his 11 shipmates watched the rest of the battle from a life raft. The other PTs fired 12 fish, but didn't even claim any hits. Either Lieutenant Westholme or Lieutenant Faulkner had scored, however, for the Hatsukes had caught a torpedo under the wardroom. The Japanese skipper at first despaired of saving his ship, but damage control parties plugged the hole well enough so that he was able to escape before daylight. When the sun rose, the PTs still afloat picked up survivors of the 2 lost torpedo boats, and then went through the morning routine of sinking the 250 floating drums of supplies the destroyers had jettisoned. The starving Japanese, watching from the beach, must have wished all torpedo boats to hell that morning. The Japanese did come out to tow in the wreckage of the PT-43, but a New Zealand warship stepped in with a few well-placed broadsides and reduced the already splintered torpedo boat to a mess of matchwood before the Japanese could study it. Nobody but the Japanese High Command knew it at this point, but the plane and PT blockade of the Tokyo Express had won. The island garrison had been starved out. During the night between February 1st and 2nd, coast watchers reported 20 Japanese destroyers coming down the slot. The American Navy had no way of knowing it, but the Tokyo Express was running in reverse. The decks of those destroyers were clear. They were being kept clear to make room for a deckload of the starved-out Japanese on Guadalcanal. Japan was finally calling it quits and pulling out of the island. Whatever the mission of the Japanese ships, the mission of the American Navy was clear: to keep the Japanese from doing whatever it was they were doing, and to sink some ships in the process. 3 American mine layers sprinkled 300 mines north of Guadalcanal, near Savo Island, in the waters where the destroyers might be expected to pass. 11 PTs waiting in ambush attacked the destroyers as they steamed by the minefield. The PTs rejoiced at a good, solid hit on a destroyer by somebody, nobody was sure whom, and the destroyer Makigumo admittedly acquired an enormous hole in the hull at that very moment, but the Japanese skipper said that he hit a mine. He said he never saw any PTs attacking him. Post-war assessment officers say that he probably hit a mine while maneuvering to avoid a PT torpedo. Avoid a torpedo attack he never even saw. Someone is confused. Some of the PT sailors who were sure of hits on the Makigumo have a tendency to get sulky when this minefield business is mentioned, and nobody can blame them. The Makigumo, at any rate, had to be scuttled. Regardless of what damage they did to the Japanese, the PTs themselves suffered terribly in this battle. Lieutenant J.H. Claggett's 111 was hit by a shell and set afire. The crew swam until morning, fighting off sharks and holding up the wounded. 2 torpedo boatmen were killed. Ensign James J. Kelly's 37 caught a shell on the gas tank and disappeared in a puff of orange flame. 1 badly wounded man survived. Ensign Ralph L. Richards' 123 had stalked to within 500 yards of a destroyer when a Japanese glide bomber slid in from nowhere, dropped a single bomb, and made possibly the most fantastically lucky hit of the war. The bomb landed square on the tiny fantail of the racing PT boat. The boat went up in a blur of flames and splinters. 4 men were killed. In spite of the fierce attacks of the PT flotilla, Tanaka's sailors managed to take the destroyers into the beach, load a shipment of evacuees, and slip out again for the quick run home. This was the last, and by far the bloodiest action, of the PTs in the Guadalcanal campaign. The PTs had lost 3 boats and 17 men in the battle, and had not scored themselves, unless you count the destroyer Mokigumo, which PT sailors stubbornly insist is theirs. An overall summary of their contribution to the campaign for Guadalcanal, however, gives them a whopping score. A submarine and a destroyer sunk, not counting Mokigumo. 2 destroyers badly damaged. Tons of Japanese supply drums riddled and sunk. Dozens of disaster victims pulled from the water. 2 massive bombardments just possibly scared off. And, by far the most important credit, the Tokyo Express of Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka ambushed and definitely turned back twice after a powerful cruiser force had failed at the job. Even after the post-war assessment teams cut down PT sinking credits to a fraction of PT claims, there is still plenty of credit left for a force 10 times the size of the Tulagi fleet.